He kept her name in a small leather book for 2 years and never spoke it aloud. She filed the papers without ever asking him why. Now the country votes, and somewhere between the lecterns, a question neither of them buried is about to climb back into the light. We begin our story now. The green room smelled of cold tea and nerves. Hermione stood before a tall, foxed mirror in the corner of the holding chamber the Wizengamot had assigned her, and watched a woman she barely recognized tug at the cuff of an oxblood robe. The woman in the glass was composed. The woman in the glass had a small, deliberate line of kohl along her lash and a sheaf of notes she had memorized 3 days ago and could recite backwards in her sleep. The woman in the glass was not the woman whose pulse was knocking, slow and absurd, against the inside of her wrist. She had prepared for everything: trade with Bulgaria, the werewolf registry, the contested clauses in the magical property reform bill. She had prepared for hostile questions about her 2 years at the Department of Magical Law Enforcement and her 3 at the Wizengamot itself. She had prepared, even, for someone to ask whether a Muggle-born witch could truly understand the older houses she now proposed to tax. She had not prepared for the simple, unbearable fact that in 7 minutes she would walk onto a stage and see him. A soft knock. 5 minutes, Madam Granger. A voice she did not know. The aides changed every week. Thank you. She turned from the mirror. On the small writing desk, her notes lay in their neat, alphabetized order, and beside them, a single envelope of heavy cream parchment had been delivered an hour ago. She had not opened it. She did not need to. She knew the hand, the slight backward slope of the G, the unbroken line beneath her name, the way one knows a scar by touch alone. Granger. He had not called her that in 7 years. Then he had called her my wife, and then he had called her Hermione, very quietly when he thought she was sleeping. And then, in the final months, he had not called her anything at all. She slid the envelope into the inner pocket of her robe, against her ribs, and walked out into the corridor. The Wizengamot had chosen the old ceremonial hall for the debate, a long, vaulted chamber 3 floors beneath the atrium, where the ceiling had been enchanted to hold a perpetual pewter-coloured sky. 2 lecterns stood 20 feet apart on a raised dais. Between them, an aura moderator in dress robes. Behind them, banked tiers of seats, everyone occupied. Above, the press gallery, quills already trembling in mid-air like a flock of impatient birds. She walked to her lectern from stage left. He walked to his from stage right. For one suspended breath, the hall did not exist. There was only the small, peculiar economy of a man crossing 20 feet of polished basalt. The precise length of his stride, the way he kept his shoulders down rather than squared, the pale gleam of his hair under the floating candles. He had cut it shorter. There was a thread of grey at the left temple that had not been there before. 2 years had thinned him through the cheek and added something to the jaw. A stillness, she thought, that had never quite settled into him while they had lived together. He reached his lectern. He set his hands on either side of it, palms flat, and only then did he look across at her. The grey of his eyes had not changed. Her own hand, of its own accord, moved to her cuff and smoothed it, although it did not need smoothing. He saw the gesture. She knew he saw it because the corner of his mouth did something. Not a smile, not anything that could be photographed. And then went still again, the way a pond goes still after a stone has fallen all the way through. "Witches and wizards," said the moderator. Her voice climbed the vaulted ceiling and came back doubled. "Madam Hermione Jean Granger, candidate for the Reform Coalition. Mr. Draco Lucius Malfoy, candidate for the Heritage Alliance. The first of 3 debates before the vote on the 21st. Each candidate will have 90 seconds to respond to each question. Direct address is permitted. Direct address is..." A small, dry pause. "Encouraged." Somewhere in the gallery, a witch laughed. It was cut off quickly. The first question was about the flu network levy. Hermione answered it cleanly. She had answered worse questions in worse rooms. Draco answered it well, better than she had expected, although she was not certain why she had expected less. His voice had aged. There was a courtroom polish in it now, the unhurried cadence of a man who had learned, somewhere in the years she had not been watching, to let a silence do the work that a raised voice would once have done. The second question was about the werewolf registry. He took a measured line. She took a sharper one. The audience stirred. The third question came from a small, neat wizard in the front row of the press gallery. He was from the Prophet. She knew him. He had written, 23 months ago, a column called Granger Malfoy, the quiet collapse of the decade's most watched marriage, and he had used the word icily 4 times in 800. He rose. He cleared his throat. He smiled. "A question," he said, "for both candidates. Your manifestos each include a section on marital property reform. Madam Granger proposes a 50-50 default split of magical estate in the absence of contract. Mr. Malfoy proposes weighted division based on ancestral attribution. Given that the public is, somewhat familiar with your own recent settlement." The gallery did not laugh, but the sound it made was the sound of a gallery deciding not to laugh. "Would each of you tell us how your personal experience has informed your policy?" The hall went very quiet. She felt the envelope against her ribs. She felt also the small, distant click of something she had thought safely locked. It made no sound. It did not need to. Draco answered first. He was entitled to. The moderator had alternated openings, and this question fell to him. He took his time. He did not look at Hermione. He looked at a point 3 feet above the Prophet journalist's head. "My policy," he said, "is not informed by my personal experience. My policy is informed by 400 years of inheritance law and the particular vulnerabilities it has created for both the older houses and the people who marry into them." A pause. "I will say, however, since you ask, that no settlement I have signed in my life was as generous as the one I signed 2 years ago, and no division of estate I have ever proposed in this manifesto would have left me with less." A murmur went through the gallery. He had told them nothing. He had told them everything. It was, she thought, with a small reluctant tilt of her chin, a beautifully written sentence. He stopped. He did not look at her. The moderator turned. "Madam Granger, 90 seconds. She gripped the edges of her lectern. The wood was cool under her palms and slightly waxed, the way the ministry waxed everything, as though polish were a substitute for repair. "My policy," she said, and her voice came out exactly as she had practiced it, which surprised her because nothing else inside her was where she had left it. is informed by the simple observation that magical estates in this country have, for centuries, been structured to advantage the partner with the older name. Mr. Malfoy's proposal preserves that structure with cosmetic modifications. Mine does not. A breath. She should have stopped there. She had been told by 3 different advisors to stop there if the question went where this one had gone. She did not stop there. As to my personal experience, she looked at him then, fully for the first time since they had taken the stage. It has informed me that the question of who owns what at the end of a marriage is the least interesting question one can ask. The interesting question is what each party was willing to say while it was still a marriage, and what each party was not. She heard very clearly the sound of 200 quills not moving. Draco's hands on the lectern had gone white at the knuckle. The moderator opened her mouth. The moderator's mouth was perhaps going to suggest that they move on to the next topic. The moderator did not get the chance. "Direct address is permitted," Draco said, not loudly. The vaulted ceiling carried it anyway. The moderator closed her mouth. He turned then. He did not step away from his lectern, but he turned, the whole long line of his body, until he was facing Hermione across the 20 feet of polished stone, and the press gallery above them all leaned forward in a single, soft, terrible motion, like wheat under wind. "Then ask it, Granger," he said. His voice was very quiet and very level, and the courtroom polish had thinned to almost nothing. "On the record, ask the interesting question." She had been a barrister. She had argued before the full bench of the Wizengamot. She had stood once 3 feet from a Death Eater on trial and asked him without a tremor to describe the night her parents' memories had been altered. She had never, in any of those rooms, felt what she felt now, which was not fear and not anger and not even quite grief, but the precise, vertiginous sensation of standing at the lip of something she had spent 2 years pretending was not there. "This is not the venue," she said. "You chose it. I did not. You did." Still quiet, still level. "The moment you said what each party was willing to say, you chose it, Hermione. So, choose it." He had not used her given name in public in more than 2 years. She had not heard him use it at all in 22 months. The shape of it in his mouth was the same as it had ever been. The slight clip on the consonants, the way he never quite finished the final A, as though her name were a sentence he had decided not to complete. The hall waited. She drew a breath. The envelope shifted against her ribs. "Very well," she said. "Here is the interesting question. Why, in 5 years of marriage, did you never once, not once, Mr. Malfoy, say aloud the thing you came home and wrote down?" His face did not change. His hands on the lectern did. She had not meant to say it. She had not, until the sentence had left her, known that she knew about the journals at all. The small, leather-bound books she had found after in the bottom drawer of his study, the ones with her name on every other page, and not one word of any of it ever spoken to her face. She had told no one. She had not even told herself, properly, until this moment, with 200 quills and the entire wizarding press watching her hands. "Madam Granger," said the moderator with admirable doomed calm, "I believe we should—" "Because," said Draco, and his voice this time was not level at all, I was a coward. The quills moved. The quills moved like a flock of starlings going up off a field all at once, and the prophet journalist in the front row dropped his teacup, which had not, until that moment, been anywhere visible, and somewhere in the upper gallery a witch said a small, undefended sound, and Hermione looked at Draco Malfoy across 20 feet of stage light, and did not yet know what to do with the man who had just said, on the record in front of the Wizarding Nation, the one sentence he had never said to her in the kitchen of the house they had once owned together. The moderator stood. The moderator was saying something about a short recess. Hermione did not hear it. She heard, instead, the sound of her own breathing and of his, 20 feet away, and the soft, ridiculous flutter of a quill that had finally been dropped onto parchment in the gallery overhead. He looked at her. He did not look away. "I'll see you in the green room," he said. And he stepped down from the lectern, and the doors at the back of the dais opened, and Draco Malfoy walked off the stage of the first debate of his political career, with the eyes of every photographer in Britain on his shoulders. And Hermione Granger remained at her lectern with one hand still curled around its waxed edge, and the envelope still unopened against her ribs, and the enchanted ceiling above them turned very slowly from pewter to a deeper bruised slate, the way a sky turns when a storm has finally agreed to arrive. The owl arrived at 6 minutes past 5. Hermione had not slept. She had not undressed. She was sitting at the kitchen table of the small Bloomsbury flat she had bought after the settlement, with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold an hour ago, and she was watching the window for precisely this: a tawny owl, a copy of the Prophet, the slow and entirely predictable end of a private life. The owl knocked twice with its beak. She rose. She let it in. She paid the 3 knuts with steady fingers, and the owl, which seemed almost apologetic, dipped its head once and was gone before she had unrolled the paper. The headline ran the full width of the front page in 50-point type. "I was a coward." Malfoy's stage confession. Rocks race below it, a photograph, not of him at the lectern, of her at the lectern, turned half away from the camera, the line of her throat visible above the oxblood collar, her eyes fixed on something the photograph did not show. She looked, in the picture, like a woman who had just been told a piece of news she had not yet decided whether to believe. She set the paper down on the table. She did not read the article. She knew, without reading, what it would say. Sources close to the former couple. Reliable observers note. Those who attended the wedding will recall. The press had been writing the same article in different fonts for 7 years. The kettle in the corner whistled. She had not put it on. The flat, sensing her, had done it for her. One of the small, polite enchantments she had layered into the place when she moved in alone. The kind of magic that filled silences without being asked. She poured fresh tea. She did not drink it. She thought, instead, of his hands on the lectern, of the moment the knuckles had gone white, of the particular angle at which he had held his head when he said, "I was a coward," slightly lowered, the way one lowers a head before a blow, not after. The owl returned at 20 past 5. A different owl. A small, sharp-eyed eagle owl with a single envelope tied to its leg, and the seal she would have known in the dark. A coiled serpent in green wax, pressed lightly so that the pattern was just legible. She untied the letter. The owl waited, polite, on the back of the chair. The note was 3 lines. Granger, co-interview, 10 o'clock, Ministry Press Office. They forced it. I tried to refuse. I am sorry for last night. Not for what I said, for where I said it. No signature. None was needed. She read it 3 times. The second time she noticed that he had crossed out a word between sorry and for, something short, perhaps only, perhaps truly, and had drawn a careful line through it twice, the way he had always crossed out words when he had not wanted her to be able to read what he had nearly written. She folded the note in half. She folded it again. She put it in the drawer of the kitchen table, the drawer where she had once kept their joint tax correspondence, and which had been empty for 2 years. Then she went to dress for the ministry. The press office occupied a corner suite on level 2, behind a frosted glass door etched with a stylized quill. When she arrived at 4 minutes to 10, the corridor outside was already lined with photographers, held back by a velvet rope and 2 extremely tired auras. Flashbulbs went off in small white-hot detonations as she passed. She did not turn her head. She had learned, in the divorce, not to turn her head. Inside the suite, the air was warmer and smelled of furniture polish and someone's bergamot tea. A round table had been set with 2 chairs. A third chair, slightly apart, held the interviewer, Pansy Parkinson, who had become, in the years since the war, the Wizarding Nation's most read political columnist, and who had, with what Hermione could only assume was a personal sense of theatre, requested this assignment herself. Pansy rose. Granger. Parkinson. He's not here yet. He will be. I know. Pansy's mouth did the thing it did when she was suppressing a smile. I only meant, there's tea. While we wait. Earl Grey, no sugar, splash of milk. She paused. I remembered. Hermione accepted the cup without comment. The remembering was not a kindness. It was a small, surgical reminder that Pansy had been at the wedding, at the christening of Harry's eldest, at the dinner parties of the first 3 years of the marriage. That Pansy had, for a brief and unlikely period, been a person who knew how Hermione took her tea. Hermione drank a careful sip. The door opened. He came in without ceremony. He was wearing a dark grey robe over a charcoal suit, no tie, the top button of his shirt undone in a way that was not, she knew, careless. He had not shaved. There was a small, raw place on the underside of his jaw where the razor had skipped, and she could not tell whether it was from haste or from a hand that had not been quite steady. He stopped, 2 paces inside the door, and looked at her. She set the cup down. Mr. Malfoy, said Pansy, with a brightness that fooled precisely no one. Do sit. He sat. He sat across from Hermione, 3 feet of polished walnut between them, and he placed his hands on the table, palms down, fingers spread, and did not move them. She noticed that he had taken off his wedding ring. He had taken it off, she knew, 2 years ago. She noticed it again anyway, the way one notices the absence of a tooth with the tongue, helplessly, every few seconds. Right, said Pansy. I'll begin with the obvious. Last night, the Heritage Alliance's press office has spent... She consulted a small notebook. Approximately 7 hours attempting to characterize Mr. Malfoy's remark as a comment about his political record rather than his personal one. The Reform Coalition's press office has refused to comment at all. So, For the readers of tomorrow's column, Mr. Malfoy, when you said I was a coward, to whom were you speaking? A small, ugly silence. Draco did not look at Pansy. He looked at the grain of the table. To the question, he said. Try again. He lifted his eyes. He looked, not at Pansy, but at Hermione. To my former wife. The quill on Pansy's notebook began on its own to write. Hermione watched it move. It was easier, somehow, than watching his face. And what, Mr. Malfoy, were you a coward about? That is between my former wife and me. You made it rather less so last night. Yes. A pause. I did. Pansy turned. Madam Granger, your response on the record to Mr. Malfoy's statement. Hermione set her teacup precisely in the centre of its saucer. The porcelain made a small, clean sound against itself. My response, she said, is that I do not conduct private correspondence in public. Neither, until last night, did Mr. Malfoy. I assume his lapse will not be repeated. She did not look at him as she said it. She did not need to. She felt the slight movement of him across the table. Not a flinch. He had never been a man who flinched, but the small recalibration of a body that has been told courteously where the door is. Will it, Mr. Malfoy, said Pansy, be repeated? He was a long time answering. No, he said finally. It will not. A pity, Pansy murmured, and the quill wrote it down, and Hermione looked up at last, and across the table she saw that Draco was already looking at her, and that something in his face had gone very carefully blank in the way it used to go blank years ago, when she had said something at a dinner party that he had decided in real time that he was not going to let anyone see had wounded him. The interview lasted 43 minutes. Hermione answered afterwards 6 questions about trade policy, 4 about the Goblin Treaties, 2 about her position on the Hogwarts curriculum review, and she answered them all with the easy, well-oiled fluency of a woman who had given the same answers in 7 different rooms in the past month. Draco answered his questions in the same way. They did not address one another again. When Pansy rose to end the session, the quill paused mid-word, hovering over the page like a hawk that had lost interest in the field. One last question, Pansy said. Off the record, if you like. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them said off the record. Pansy took the silence as permission, as Pansy always had. Why are you both still doing this? She looked between them. The question was not, Hermione understood with a small, unwelcome lurch, about the campaign. Draco answered first. He answered without looking at Hermione. He answered the grain of the table. Because the alternative, he said, is not doing it, and I have tried that. Pansy turned. Granger. Hermione opened her mouth. She had a clean, sharp answer ready. She had 3 of them, in fact, alphabetized, and she did not, in the event, give any of them. Because I cannot yet, she said, think of what else to do. The quill wrote it down. The quill, she thought, should not have written it down. It had been agreed that the question was off the record. Pansy, who never permitted herself to look surprised, looked surprised. She tapped the quill with one fingernail. The quill stopped. Right, Pansy said briskly. We're done. Out the back, both of you. The photographers are still in the corridor. Granger first. Mr. Malfoy, give it 3 minutes, would you? There's a love. Hermione stood. She gathered her bag. She walked without looking at him, to the small side door that Pansy had indicated. She had her hand on the brass of the handle when he spoke. "Granger." She did not turn. "Yes." "The envelope," he said, very quietly behind her. "Last night, I'd rather you didn't open it." Her hand tightened on the door handle. She felt the cold of the brass print itself into her palm. "Why?" A pause, long enough that she almost turned. She did not. "Because I wrote it 3 years ago," he said, "and I no longer agree with the man who wrote it. And I should like, if I am to be permitted any small mercy in this lifetime, to be allowed to disagree with him in private." She stood with her hand on the handle. The corridor beyond the door was silent. The interview room behind her was silent. Pansy, with what was either tact or appetite, had stepped very deliberately to the far window and was looking out at the grey London morning as though she had business there. Hermione turned the handle. She did not turn her head. "Then disagree with him in private, Draco," she said. "I have not opened it. I am not certain I will." She stepped through. She closed the door behind her with a small, precise click that was not a slam, although a slam would have been easier. And she walked down the back corridor of the Ministry press office with her bag against her hip and the envelope, still sealed, still folded, still unread, pressing its slight weight against the inside of her ribs. Behind her, in the room she had left, Draco Malfoy lowered his face into his hands for the space of one slow, uncounted breath, and Pansy Parkinson at the window did not turn around, because there are some things even a columnist will not put in print. She did not open the envelope. For 3 days she did not open it. She carried it from room to room, as though it were a small sleeping animal she had agreed to mind on someone else's behalf. To the kitchen in the morning, to her desk in the campaign office at Diagon Alley, to the bedside table at night where it lay beside her wand, and the half-read manuscript of a paper on goblin contractual law she had been failing for a week to finish. She did not open it. She also did not destroy it. Both of these facts, she understood, were answers in their own right. On the 4th morning, she went to the Ministry archive. There was a clause in the Magical Property Reform Bill, the contested 7th subsection, that hinged on a precedent from 1847, and her team had failed 3 times to find a clean copy of the original ruling. She had decided at 4 in the morning that she would find it herself. It was the kind of decision one made at 4 in the morning when one had been carrying an unopened envelope for 3 days and required, urgently, a reason to think about something else. The archive occupied the entire 7th sub-level of the Ministry, a long honeycomb of stone corridors lit by floating lanterns that adjusted themselves with a soft and slightly anxious flicker to the reading speed of whoever passed beneath. The air down here had the particular dryness of preserved parchment, a faint mineral cold, like the inside of a chalk pit, threaded with the green note of the copper lamps. She loved it. She had loved it as a junior law clerk, and she loved it now with a quieter and more complicated love, the way one loves a place one has stopped being able to visit casually. The 1847 rulings were shelved in the long gallery off the 3rd corridor. She passed 3 witches at reading carols, none of whom looked up. She turned the corner into the gallery. He was already there. He was standing at the far end of the aisle, beneath a lantern that had brightened obligingly to a soft amber, and his hand was raised to a high shelf, his fingers just touching the spine of a slim, oxblood-bound volume. He had a coat folded over one arm. He had not, she noted with an irritation that surprised her by its smallness, taken off his gloves to handle the books. She stopped. He turned his head. He did not lower his hand. Granger. Malfoy. A beat. He gestured very slightly at the shelf. I was looking for the Pemberton versus Pemberton ruling for the 7th subsection. So was I. Of course you were. The corner of his mouth did something, not quite the same thing it had done on the stage. Smaller, wearier. Bottom shelf, 3rd volume from the left. I checked. It's been rebound. The spine reads 1849. The cataloguer was a Hufflepuff and an optimist. She did not move. He did not move. They stood at opposite ends of the aisle, as though the floor between them were not floor, but water that neither of them had been given permission to wade. Thank you, she said. He inclined his head. He withdrew his hand from the high shelf, slowly, deliberately, the way a man withdraws a hand from a horse he is not certain of, and turned his body slightly, opening the aisle, seeding it. She walked the length of the gallery to the shelf he had named. She knelt. The 3rd volume from the left was indeed 1847 misbound as 1849. She drew it out. The leather of the cover was soft with age, the gilt of the title worn down to a faint ghost of itself. She rose with the book against her chest, and she found, when she turned, that he had not left the gallery. He had moved to the long reading table set against the wall, and he had laid out his coat on the back of a chair, and he was unpacking, from a battered leather case, 3 other volumes, and a small ink-stained notebook. She had not, somehow, considered that he might be working here. You're researching, she said. I am a candidate. He did not look up. Researching is what one does. You used to send a clerk. I used to do a great many things. He set down the last volume and finally looked at her. The lamp above the reading table dropped a soft, warm wash across the left side of his face, and she saw, for the first time in clear, close light, that the line of grey at his temple was wider than she had thought. I find I prefer the books these days. They argue less. They do not argue at all. Yes, he said, that is what I find I prefer. She stood with the volume against her chest. The lantern over her own shoulder brightened, then dimmed, then brightened again, as though it could not decide what speed her thinking had settled at. I will take this to a different Carol, she said. You needn't. I will. Granger. He set down his quill. There are 47 reading positions in this gallery. There is no reason for either of us to leave. There is one reason. Yes, he said. There is. I am asking you, all the same. The lantern dipped. She walked, after a moment, to the far end of the long table. She set down the volume. She sat. She did not look at him. She opened the book to the index and began, with steady fingers, to find the page reference she had come for. He returned to his own work. For 19 minutes they did not speak. She found the ruling. She copied 2 paragraphs in her smallest hand. She cross-referenced a footnote that led her, irritatingly, to a 2nd volume in another aisle, and she rose and fetched it and returned without looking at him. And he did not, when she passed his chair, look up. In the 20th minute, he said, without lifting his eyes from his page. You always underlined in blue. She did not stop writing. I still do. I know. I can see your annotations on the Pemberton margin from here. A pause. Subsection 3, the part about transferable estate. You wrote circular. 3 years ago, I imagine? 4. Quite right. He turned a page. The sound of the parchment in the long, lantern-lit quiet was the sound of weather in a room with no windows. You were correct. The reasoning is circular. The whole 1847 court was circular. I have spent 6 weeks trying to find a way around it. There isn't one. No, he said. I have come to that conclusion. She set down her quill. She looked, for the first time in 20 minutes, fully at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at his own notebook, and his quill was perfectly still in his hand, and she could see, in the dim, warm light, the small unevenness of his breathing. Draco, she said. He set the quill down. He still did not look at her. What did you write in it? She said. He understood at once. She had known he would. I do not remember exactly. Yes, you do. He was quiet. The lantern above her own chair brightened a degree, as though it were also waiting. I wrote it the week you left, he said finally. I wrote that I had been wrong about all of it, that I had been wrong specifically about the night we did not speak in the kitchen, and about the morning after, and about the 7 mornings after that one. That I had not known, until you were gone from the house, what the house had been. That he drew a breath, very slow, very level. That I would not, given the choice again, choose any of the silences I chose. That I would, given the chance, have spoken first. That I would have said the things you needed me to say, instead of the things I was afraid to discover I meant. That is, in essence, what is in the envelope. There is more of it. It is not better. She did not speak. Her hand had stilled on the quill she had picked up again without noticing. And then, she said, and then I did not send it. Why not? He lifted his eyes. The grey of them in the lamplight was darker than it had been at the lectern, the way water is darker close to the bank than out in the middle of a lake. He looked at her with the same level attention he had given her at the altar 8 years ago, in a chapel hung with white lilies, and she had not, until this moment, understood how much of him had been in that look even then. Because, by the time I had written it, he said, you had already filed. The lantern over the table flared, settled, dimmed. She looked down at her hands. They were perfectly steady. They had always been perfectly steady. It had been, in some sense, the trouble. I filed, she said, because you did not speak. And you did not speak, you tell me now, because I had filed. We have been very efficient, Draco. We have been very, very efficient at not knowing one another. Yes, he said, we have. A long silence. She rose, finally. She gathered her notes. She closed the misbound Pemberton. She set it back on the shelf, the spine flush with its neighbours, and she came back to the table, and she stood with her hand on the back of a chair 3 places down from him. I have not opened it, she said. I know. I am still not certain I will. I know. But I am no longer certain I will not. He looked up. The lamp dropped its warm wash across his face. He did not smile. He did, however, very slightly, set down the quill he had picked up again and lay both his hands flat on the table, the way he had laid them at the press office that morning. palms down, fingers spread, as though anchoring himself to a surface that he did not otherwise trust to hold him. "That," he said, "is more than I had asked for. You asked me not to open it." "Yes." A very small breath. "I did. I lied. I should like very much for you to open it. I have not, in 2 years, been able to think of a way to ask." She stood with her hand on the back of the chair. The archive around them was full of the soft, attentive breathing of paper. Somewhere on a higher level, a clock struck the half-hour and was answered dimly by another. The lantern above her bent its light a degree closer, considerate as a friend. "I will think about it," she said. She did not say goodbye. He did not say goodbye. She walked the length of the gallery with her notes against her chest and her wand hand free at her side, and at the corner of the third corridor she paused just for a heartbeat and looked back. He had not moved. He was sitting at the long table with his hands still flat against the wood, and his head was bowed, and the lantern above him had gone, of its own accord, a softer and more forgiving amber, the way the light goes in a room where someone has finally permitted themselves to be tired. She turned. She walked on. The envelope against her ribs felt, for the first time in 4 days, not like a sleeping animal, but like a letter, which is to say, a thing addressed to her, which is to say, a thing she might, in time and on her own terms, decide to read. She climbed the stair to level 2, with her hand pressed lightly to the place where the parchment lay, and the lanterns of the archive behind her dimmed one by one as she rose, the way lanterns do in a place that has decided to keep its counsel until it is needed again. The second debate was held in the Hall of Reconciliation. The choice of venue had been the Wizengamot's idea of cleverness, the long, narrow chamber on level 5, where, in the years immediately after the war, families had come to formally forgive one another, or to formally fail to. The walls were panelled in pale ash, the kind of wood that was said to hold no enchantment well, so that no one in the room could be magically compelled to say a thing they did not mean. It was a venue that took itself very seriously. Hermione had been called to give evidence here twice as a junior barrister, and she had not, on either occasion, enjoyed the experience. Tonight, the chamber had been rearranged. 2 lecterns on a low dais. The moderator's table between them. Behind the dais, the long banked benches where 800 members of the public had been admitted by ballot. The press, this time, had been confined to a partitioned gallery at the rear, behind a charmed glass screen that muffled the scratching of their quills to a soft, anxious rustle, like mice in a wainscot. She arrived at 20 minutes to the hour. She walked down the central aisle to the dais without looking at the gallery, and she took her place at the left-hand lectern, and she set out her notes. Fewer notes tonight than the first debate. She had learned that lesson, and she straightened her cuff once, deliberately, because she had decided that if she was going to make the gesture, she would make it on her own terms and not the gesture's. Draco arrived at 3 minutes to the hour. He walked in, alone. No aide, no minder, no carefully trailing press officer. He was wearing a deep slate robe she had not seen before, well cut, severe, No pin or chain at the collar. His hair was a little damp at the temples. It had been raining when she came in, and he had walked, then, from somewhere beyond the ministry's covered entry. He passed her lectern without turning his head. He took his place. He set out 3 pages of notes. He did not look at her. The envelope was at home. She had left it that morning on the kitchen table beside the cold mug, in the same place she had left it for 4 days. She had not opened it. She had decided in the cab on the way over that she would not open it tonight. She had decided in the lift down to level 5 that she would not open it tomorrow. She had decided, walking down the central aisle, that she would, perhaps, the morning after the debate, and she had been faintly surprised by the precision of the decision, which she had not made consciously, and which felt, for that reason, almost trustworthy. "Witches and wizards," said the moderator, a different one tonight, a tall wizard with a clipped Welsh accent. The second of 3 debates, the subject for the evening: trade, treaty, and the welfare of magical beings. 90 seconds per response. Direct address. A small dry cough is permitted. The gallery did not laugh. The gallery had learned since the last debate not to laugh at small dry coughs. The first 3 questions were trade. She handled them. He handled them. Both of them, she thought with a small, distant clarity, were better at this tonight than they had been 5 days ago. Something had been resolved, or perhaps merely set down. Whatever it was, it left their hands freer for the work in front of them. He cited a treaty clause she had not expected him to know. She conceded the citation with a nod that the gallery noted. He nodded back. The Welsh moderator looked faintly relieved. The 4th question was about the centaur clans of the West Midlands. She gave a careful answer about consultation and the failures of the previous administration. He gave a careful answer about land rights and the limits of magical enforcement. The moderator turned over a card. "A question from a member of the public," he said. "Selected by ballot. Mrs. Iris Tregowan, Falmouth." A small witch in the 3rd row rose. She was perhaps 60. She wore a knitted shawl. She held her question in her hand and read it carefully, as though she did not entirely trust her own voice with the words. "My question is for both candidates," she said. "The welfare of magical beings means, to my mind, the welfare of those creatures who cannot speak for themselves at law. House elves, goblins below the age of reasoning, the Kelpie colonies of the Western Locks, children born to magical parents who have not yet chosen a wand." A small breath. "My question is, how does either of you propose to legislate for a being who cannot, by definition, hold you to your promise? Whose trust, once broken, cannot be repaired in any court, and who, having been failed, will not ask for redress? How do you legislate for that? How does either of you propose to be trusted by such a being? I should like a personal answer, please, not a policy one." The Welsh moderator opened his mouth. The Welsh moderator, perhaps wisely, closed it again. Hermione's hand had gone of its own volition to the cuff. She stopped it. She placed it back on the lectern. She drew a careful, level breath. "Madam Tregowan," she said, "thank you for the question. I will answer it personally, as you asked." She did not look at Draco. She could not, just at this moment, look at Draco. "I do not believe one can legislate for a being who will not ask for redress. One can only, at best, build a system in which redress is offered before it is sought. a system in which the powerful party is required by law and by habit to ask the question that the unprotected party cannot. That has been, in essence, the work of my career. I do not claim to have done it well. I have, on more than one occasion, failed at it in private as comprehensively as I have tried to succeed at it in public. I will say only that I have not stopped trying, and that I do not propose to stop. She inclined her head. She stepped back from the lectern an inch. She had given the answer well, she thought, and as cleanly as she could have given it. And she felt, all the same, the small, precise sensation of a sentence that had not quite been about house elves. The moderator turned. "Mr. Malfoy, 90 seconds. Draco did not look at his notes. He looked first at the small witch in her shawl. He looked at her with a steadiness Hermione recognized. It was the steadiness he kept for things he had decided to take seriously. "Madam Tregowan," he said, "thank you. I will not give you a policy answer either. I will give you, with your permission, 2 answers, of which only the first will be of any use to you politically." He paused. The hall waited. "The first answer is that one legislates for such a being," he said, "by surrendering in advance some part of one's own discretion. By writing into law that one will ask, on a fixed schedule and in a fixed form, whether the unprotected party is well. By making the asking a duty rather than a kindness. Kindness is not a reliable instrument of state. Duty is somewhat more so. That is the answer I will be running on. It is, broadly, also the answer my opponent will be running on, although she will phrase it better, and her party's drafting clerks are demonstrably superior to mine." A small ripple in the gallery. Hermione did not let her face move. "The second answer," he said. And here, for the first time, he turned slightly, and the line of his shoulders altered, and although he was speaking still to Mrs. Tregowan, he was no longer, in any meaningful sense, speaking only to her. "Is that one cannot, by any law I am aware of, oblige a person to ask the question they are most afraid to ask. One can only, having failed to ask it, admit afterwards that one did not, and accept that the admission is not by itself sufficient, and keep on admitting it, and keep on asking in whatever form is left to one, even when the asking has been made very late. That is not a policy. That is, I am afraid, only a habit one can attempt to acquire. I am attempting to acquire it. I am, in this regard, a beginner." The hall did not breathe. The Welsh moderator looked very briefly at the ceiling, as though consulting some private authority about whether the rules of debate had just been broken. He decided, with a small visible shrug of the shoulders, that they had not. "Madam Granger," he said, "right of reply, 30 seconds. She had 30 seconds. She did not need them. "Mr. Malfoy," she said, "has answered the question better than I did." The gallery, this time, did not stir. The gallery had, somewhere in the last 2 minutes, gone very still in the particular way a room goes still when it has stopped being a room and become a witness. The Welsh moderator made a small, careful note on his card. "We will move," he said, "to the next subject." They moved. They debated for 40 minutes more the Goblin Treaties and the regulation of dragon hides and the renewal of the Beauxbatons exchange. They debated well. Neither of them turned again towards the personal. The Welsh moderator, who had been bracing himself for it, slowly unbraced. The press gallery's muffled rustle slackened to an occasional flick. At the end of the final exchange, the moderator closed his notes. Witches and wizards. The second debate is concluded. Candidates, you have 3 minutes for closing remarks. Madam Granger, you have the floor. She gave her closing. It was the closing she had prepared. She spoke about the bill, the consultation process, the timetable for the autumn session. She thanked the public for the ballot system. She did not look at Draco. She stepped back. Mr. Malfoy. He looked at his notes. He did not, in the event, use them. I had a prepared closing, he said. I am not, with the moderator's indulgence, going to give it. I am going to say, instead, only this. I have stood twice now on a stage opposite a person I lived with for 5 years. I have, in that time, said 2 things in public that I did not say to her in private. I would like the record to reflect that I am aware of the shape of that failure. I would like the record to reflect also that I do not, whatever the outcome of this vote, propose to repeat it. The country will choose its minister on the 21st. The country is entitled to choose. I will only add, for what little it is worth, that my opponent has been, throughout these proceedings, the better candidate, and that if the country chooses her, the country will not have erred. Thank you. He stepped back from the lectern. The hall did not applaud. The hall did not, for a long heartbeat, do anything at all. Then, somewhere in the 3rd row, a single pair of hands began very slowly to clap, and the small witch in the shawl was on her feet, and the clapping took up around her like a wind catching in a grove. And the press gallery's charmed glass rang faintly with the dropped quills of journalists who had not, in the event, been ready to write any of it down. Hermione stood at her lectern. She did not clap. She could not, just at this moment, clap. She had her hands on the waxed wood and her eyes on him, 20 feet away, and her chest was full of something she could not yet name. Not anger, not gratitude, not even quite recognition. Something older and more precise, the small private sensation of being known accurately, in public, for the first time in a very long while. He turned. He looked at her across the dais. He did not smile. He did, however, very slightly, incline his head, a half-bow, the smallest possible courtesy, the gesture of a man who has been raised to acknowledge, by ancient form, the person whose hand he has just released. She did not, in the event, return it. She did, however, lift her own hand from the lectern. She lifted it slowly, deliberately, the way one lifts a hand that has been pressed too long against a cold surface. And she let it hang in the air for a long moment between them, palm half open, neither raised in farewell, nor extended in greeting, only held in the warm wash of the dais lamps, as though she had finally remembered that a hand was a thing one could choose to use. Then she lowered it. She gathered her notes. She stepped down from the dais. She walked the length of the central aisle past the 800 members of the public, and she did not look at the press gallery, and she did not look back at Draco Malfoy at his lectern, and she walked out into the corridor where her aide was already waiting with her coat, and she put on her coat, and she fastened the buttons one by one, very carefully, all the way to the throat. Outside, in the rain, the cab she had ordered was idling at the curb. She did not, at once, get into it. She stood on the wet step of the ministry, with her hand on the door of the cab, and the rain coming down in long, thin lines through the lamplight. And she thought, very clearly, that she was going to open the envelope tonight, after all, and that the decision had been made for her, not by the debate and not by the speech, but by the hand she had lifted and lowered again in the lamplight, and which had told her, more plainly than anything else, that she was no longer pretending the letter did not exist. She got into the cab. She closed the door. The driver pulled out into the slick black street, and the rain came harder, and Hermione Granger sat with her gloved hands folded in her lap, and the lights of the ministry sliding away in the rear window. And she rode home through the wet London night towards a kitchen table on which a folded envelope had been waiting, very patiently, for 4 days. The flat was dark when she let herself in. She did not light the lamps with her wand. She moved by the dim grey wash from the street below, the sodium glow of the lamp at the corner of Russell Square, filtered through rain-streaked glass, laying long, pale rectangles across the floorboards. She hung up her coat. She set down her bag. She unfastened the small mother-of-pearl button at her throat and stood for a moment with one hand at her collar, listening to the rain on the windows. Then she went into the kitchen. The envelope was where she had left it that morning, on the table, beside the cold mug which the flat had quietly cleared and replaced with a clean one. The lamp above the table came on of its own accord, a soft amber, as though it had been waiting for her and did not want, just yet, to startle her. She sat down. She did not take off her shoes. She drew the envelope towards her across the wood. The cream parchment was heavier than ordinary paper, the kind they had used for their wedding invitations, the kind he had always insisted on for any letter that mattered. The seal was a plain disc of green wax, no impression pressed into it. He had not used his signet. He had not, in 3 years, used his signet on anything sent to her. She broke the seal with her thumbnail. Inside were 3 sheets, folded once. The hand on the first page was his, the slight backward slope of the G, the unbroken line beneath her name. And the ink had been laid down hard, the way he wrote when he was writing not for an audience, because he could not, otherwise, keep the words from moving. There were no crossings out. He had not, anywhere on the 3 sheets, allowed himself a second draft. She knew this because the punctuation was wrong in 2 places, and he would have corrected it if he had let himself read it back. She read, Hermione, I am writing this on the 23rd of November at 4 in the morning in the study you used to use. I am sitting at your desk. I am writing in your ink. I have not in 3 nights slept in our bed because I cannot bring myself to lie down in a bed in which you are not, and also because I cannot any longer bear to lie down in the place where, 4 months ago, we did not speak. I want, before anything else, to write down what we did not say. I want it written down. I do not, I think, intend to send this. I want it written down all the same. We did not say when we came home from St. Mungo's that we had lost a child. We said that there had been a complication. We said that we were tired. We said that the healers had been kind. We did not say the word. Neither of us said it. I waited for you to say it, because I believed, I still believe, that you carried the greater share of it in your body, and that the word was therefore yours to speak first. You did not speak it. I learned only afterwards that you had been waiting for me because you believed, and you were right to believe, that I had been raised in a family where such words were said in cold rooms by men in dark coats, and that I therefore had the practice of them, and you did not. I had the practice. I did not have the courage. We waited for one another for 4 months. The words stayed in the kitchen with us, unspoken, the entire time. It is still in the kitchen. I can feel it from here. She set the page down. She set it down very carefully, aligned to the edge of the table, as though the alignment mattered. She placed both her hands flat on the wood on either side of it. She did not weep. She had not wept 2 years ago in the kitchen of the house in Wiltshire. She had not wept in the solicitor's office. She had not wept on the steps of the chapel where she had once been married. She did not weep now. She breathed, instead, slow, even, level breaths, the way she had been taught to breathe before giving evidence, and she lifted the second sheet. I want also to write down what I did, instead of speaking. I made tea. I made tea 4 times a day for 4 months. I made tea because making tea is a thing my mother did when she did not know what else to do, and I had learned the gesture from her without learning the reason. I made you tea you did not drink. I left it on the desk, on the bedside table, on the window ledge of the room we had been making ready, and were no longer making ready. I made tea instead of saying I am sorry. I made tea instead of saying I am frightened. I made tea instead of saying I do not know how to be in this house with you, if we do not, between us, agree to admit what has happened. You did not drink the tea. You worked. You took the Hargreaves case. You took the Goblin reparations brief. You worked 16 hours a day for 4 months, and I watched you do it, and I told myself that I was respecting your method, and I was not. I was hiding behind it. I was relieved every morning that you had a brief to read, because it meant that I did not have to find the sentence I could not find. The night you filed, I was in the library. You came in. You stood in the doorway. You said only, "Draco, I have asked Mr. Pemberton to draw up the papers." I said only, "Very well." I said it without looking up from the book. I was reading, for the record, a treatise on the regulation of cauldron bottoms. I have not been able since to recall a single word of it. You waited in the doorway for perhaps half a minute. I did not look up. You went away. I did not look up because I believed, wrongly, stupidly, with the particular stupidity of a man who has been raised to mistake stillness for strength, that to look up would be to ask you to stay, and that to ask you to stay would be to admit that I had failed you, and that to admit that I had failed you would be to break in your presence in a way I had been taught never to break in any presence at all. I was wrong about all of it. She turned the page. I will not, in this letter, ask you to come back. I will not ask you anything. You have, in filing, asked me a question I should have asked first, and you are entitled to the dignity of the answer you have already chosen for yourself. I will only say, for the record, since the record has become the only place in which I can seem to say anything, that if I had, 4 months ago, in the kitchen, said the word out loud, if I had said our daughter, if I had said we have lost her, if I had said I do not know how to be alive in a house this quiet, I believe we would still be married. I am not certain. I am certain enough. I am certain enough that I have been sitting at this desk for 3 hours, unable to put down the quill. I loved you. I love you. I do not know which tense is permitted to me now. I will use both, in case one of them is wrong. Draco. She read the last lines twice. Then she folded the 3 sheets back into their creases, very precisely, and set them on the table. And she lowered her forehead onto the back of her own hand, and for the first time in 2 years, for the first time, in fact, since the night they had come home from St. Mungo's and not spoken, Hermione Granger wept. She wept without sound, the way she had learned to weep in childhood, in a muggle house where the walls had been thin. Her shoulders did not move. The hand under her forehead grew slowly damp. The lamp above the table dimmed of its own accord, considerate, and the rain outside drew its long, thin lines across the window in the dark. She did not know afterwards how long she sat. She knew only that the knock, when it came, was not a knock she had expected. It was not the brisk double tap of an owl at the kitchen window. It was a knock at her front door. 2 knocks, a pause, a third. She lifted her head. She wiped her face once with the flat of her hand and rose and walked down the short corridor to the front door, and she paused with her hand on the latch. Who is it? A pause on the other side of the door. Then, it's me. She closed her eyes. She opened them. She drew back the latch. He was standing on the landing with the rain still in his hair. He had not bothered with a charm. The shoulders of his coat were dark with it, and there was a small bright drop at the end of one strand of fringe that fell as she watched onto the back of his hand and did not seem to register with him at all. He had no umbrella. He was holding, instead, a small object wrapped in oilcloth, cradled against the inside of his arm with the careful unconsciousness of a man holding something he had carried in his own head for longer than the walk had taken. "I am sorry to come here," he said. "How did you—" "Pansy, 2 years ago. She mentioned the street. I did not then ask which number. I knocked on 3 doors. The second was a man who recognized me from the paper." He pointed up. "Draco. I will not come in. I have not come to come in. I have brought you something. I did not, this evening, want to send it by owl. I will give it to you, and I will go." She did not move from the doorway. She did not, she realized, want him to go. She also did not, just at this moment, know how to ask him to stay. The 2 facts sat in her, quite separately, with a small distinct weight of objects laid down on a balance scale. He held out the oilcloth bundle. She took it. It was not heavy. It was small, perhaps the size of her palm, and the shape under her fingers, through the cloth, was familiar. It was the shape of a small book. She unwrapped it. It was a small book. It was a small leather book, oxblood, with no title on the spine, and the cover was soft with use. And when she opened it, there, on the landing, in the dim corridor light, she saw that the pages were in his hand, and that the first page was dated 4 years ago, and that the second page bore her name. She looked up. He was watching her. The drop of rain on his hand had spread to a small dark patch on the cuff of his shirt. He did not look at the book. He looked at her face, the way he had looked at her face in the archive, steady, attentive, faintly braced, as though her face were a sentence he was reading and did not yet know the end of. "All of them," he said. "There are 8. I have brought the first. You can have the rest. you can burn the rest. I have not opened any of them in 2 years. I find that I no longer wish to keep them in a house in which you are not." She held the small book against her chest. "I do not know what to do with this," she said. "I know. I do not, just now, know what to say to you. I know that also." A pause. "Will you?" she said, and her voice was lower than she had meant it to be, lower than it had been at the lectern, lower than it had been in the archive. "Will you come in, Draco? Out of the rain. Only that. I am not. I cannot. I do not yet. Only out of the rain." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped very carefully across the threshold of the flat, and she closed the door behind him, and the small leather book stayed pressed against her ribs in the place where, for 4 days, the unopened envelope had lain. She did not, at once, lead him into the kitchen. She stood in the small entrance hall of the flat with the door closed behind him, and she watched, without quite meaning to, the way the rain dripped from the hem of his coat onto the dark slate of the floor. 3 drops, then 4, then a pause, then 1 more. And she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she had not had a man in this flat in 2 years. Not Harry, not Ron, not even her father, who lived in Hampstead and had not wished to climb the stairs. No one had stood on this slate. The flat had been, for 2 years, a place she had occupied alone, and the air in it had taken on the particular composition of a room kept that way. "Your coat," she said. He looked down. He seemed, briefly, to have forgotten he was wearing it. He undid the buttons with cold fingers. She watched the small fumble at the second button, and he did not characteristically ask for help, and she did not characteristically offer. And he hung the coat on the hook beside hers, where it had not ever hung before. The 2 coats touched at the sleeve. Neither of them looked at the place where they touched. "Through there," she said. He went through. She followed. She watched him cross her kitchen. Her kitchen, hers. The kitchen she had chosen for herself out of a brochure 2 years ago, precisely because it had not, in any single feature, resembled the kitchen in Wiltshire. And she watched the way he did not look at the surfaces of it, the way he kept his eyes on the floor and then on the chair she gestured him into, and she understood, with a small, unwelcome sting of recognition, that he was being careful not to seem to be reading her life. He sat. He set his hands on the edge of the table, palms down, fingers spread. She did not, at first, sit. She went to the dresser. She took down 2 cups, neither of which matched, both of which she had bought at a market in Lewes one Saturday in the spring. She set them on the counter. She put the kettle on the hob. The flat, which had been about to do it for her, sensed her intention and stepped back. The kettle was quiet under her hand, behaving like an ordinary kettle, the way it did when it understood she wished to be the one doing the small thing. She did not speak while it boiled. He did not speak either. The rain on the kitchen window was the only sound, a long, even patter, the kind that had set in for the night, the kind that would not, by morning, have stopped. She made the tea. She brought the cups to the table. She set one in front of him. She sat down opposite, and the small leather book was on the table between them, where she had laid it down on the way in, and neither of them, for a long moment, looked at it. "You walked," she said. From the ministry. Yes. That is 2 miles. I know. In this. Yes. She lifted her cup. She did not drink. She set it down again. She watched the steam rise off the dark surface in a thin, uncertain coil. Draco, she said. I have not yet decided what tonight is. No, he said. Nor have I. I had not, when I knocked, decided that I would knock. I had decided, walking, only that I would post the book through your door. I came up the stair. I stood on the landing. I knocked before I had agreed with myself to knock. I am not at my most composed. You appear composed. Yes, he said. That also is a thing I was taught. A small silence. She drew the book towards her across the wood. The cover, in the lamplight, was a deeper red than it had looked on the landing, the colour of old wine left in a glass. She opened it. The first page, in his hand, April 21st, the drawing room. She read aloud the 3rd clause of the werewolf bill and corrected, without looking up, the Latin in the heading. I had not, until that moment, understood that I had been waiting for an hour to hear her speak. She closed the book. Draco. Yes. Why did you write these? He was quiet. He looked at the lamp above the table, and then at the rain on the window, and then, finally, at her. Because I could not, at the time, say any of it aloud. To me, to anyone, to you in particular. I want to be precise. I could not say it to anyone. I could, especially, not say it to you. I had been raised. You know how I had been raised. To say a thing aloud was to make it true, and to make it true in another person's hearing was to give that person a hold on you, and to give a person a hold on you was, I had been taught, to lose. I have, since, come to disagree with the people who taught me this. I disagreed with them, in some sense, by the 2nd year of our marriage. I had not yet, by the 5th, found a way to disagree with them out loud. The book was, the books were, the practice. They were the place I made the words true to myself before I attempted to make them true to you. I never, in the event, attempted. Why not? Because I was afraid that if I said them aloud, and you did not say anything back, I would not survive it. Draco, I know, I am aware. It is a thing one has either felt or not felt. I am sorry. I have no better account of it. She set both her hands around her cup. The porcelain was hot. She did not, in any practical sense, mind that it was hot. I read it, she said. The letter. Yes. All of it. All of it. He drew a slow breath. He did not look away. She had not ever seen him not look away from a thing this hard. And, she said, I have been sitting at this table for an hour, and I have only now noticed that I have not, in 2 years, said the word out loud either. Not to my mother, not to Ginny, not in the journal I keep beside the bed, not even in the cab on the way here from the ministry tonight, in the small private dark of the back seat where I had every opportunity. I have built a campaign on the question of who speaks for those who cannot, and I have not, in 2 years, spoken for the person I most owed the speaking to, including, I find, myself. A long quiet. Hermione, wait. He waited. She drew a breath. She set down the cup. She put both her hands, palms flat, on the wood of the table, mirroring, without intending to, the position of his hands, and she looked at him across the small, clean span of pine. We lost our daughter, she said. He closed his eyes. He did not weep. He did not, in any visible sense, move. He sat with his eyes closed and his hands flat on the table, and a small, fine tremor went through the line of his shoulders, the kind of tremor one sees in the flank of a horse that has been standing too long in the cold. And she watched it pass through him, and she did not, this time, look away. "Yes," he said. His voice was very low. "We did. Her name was going to be Lyra. Yes. I have not said her name aloud. Nor have I. Lyra," she said. "Lyra," he said. The lamp above the table dimmed of its own accord, considerate, and the rain on the window went on with its long, even patter, and somewhere on the floor below a clock struck the hour. 11 slow, soft notes, and neither of them moved while it struck. When it had finished, he opened his eyes. "I should have come home that night and said it," he said. When the healer said the word in the corridor, I should have come into the room and sat on the edge of the bed and said, "We have lost her." Her name was going to be Lyra. I do not know how to do this with you, and I do not, more importantly, know how to do it without you. I rehearsed the sentence in the corridor for 40 minutes. I came in. I sat on the edge of the bed. I took your hand. I said that the healers had been kind. I said that we were tired. I made you tea in the morning. I have spent 2 years trying to forgive myself for the cup of tea. I have not yet managed it. Draco. Yes. I did not say it either. You were. I was the one in the bed. Yes. I was also a barrister of 7 years' standing who had argued in open court more difficult sentences than that. I did not say it. I waited for you to say it. When you did not say it, I decided in my own head that you did not wish to say it, and I built 2 years of conduct on that decision, and I was wrong. I am as responsible for the silence as you are. I have spent 2 years not knowing that, and I have spent the last 4 days since the first debate beginning to. I had not, until tonight, finished beginning to. I have finished now. He was looking at her with a quietness that had in it no defense at all. Hermione. Yes. I am not asking. I want you to understand that I am not, by being here, asking. I know you are not. I came only to bring the book. I know. I will, in a moment, go. I know. A small silence. Do not just yet go, she said. He did not. They sat at the table for a long time. They did not, in the long time, speak. The tea cooled in both cups. The rain went on. Once, an hour in, she reached across the table and laid the tips of her fingers very lightly on the back of his hand. Not a clasp, not even quite a touch, only an alignment, the way one sets 2 halves of a torn page together to see whether they belong. And he did not, at first, move. And then, very slowly, he turned his hand under hers, palm to palm, and he did not close his fingers, and she did not close hers. And they sat for perhaps 4 minutes, with their open palms resting together on the kitchen table, neither holding nor being held, only present, only there. She withdrew her hand, eventually. She did so gently. He did not, in any visible way, react. He understood, she thought, what the gesture had been and was not, and he understood also what it was not yet. At a little after 1 in the morning, he rose. I will, he said. Go now. Yes. The 3rd debate is on Friday. Yes. I have not yet decided what I am going to say. Nor have I. Hermione. Yes. Whatever I say, he said, On Friday, I want you to know, before I say it, that I am not, by saying it, asking. I have, I think, learned not to ask this past week. I have learned instead only to say. I will say a thing on Friday. I will not ask anything by it. You are entitled to hear it as a saying and not as a question. You are entitled also not to answer. She rose. She walked with him to the door of the flat. She took down his coat from the hook beside hers. The sleeves had dried in the warmth of the hall into a stiff, dark line of damp, and she held it for him while he put it on, and his shoulder, as he turned, brushed the back of her hand, and neither of them this time pretended not to feel it. He opened the door. The landing was cold. The rain on the stairwell skylight was loud. He paused on the threshold. He did not turn. He spoke with his face towards the stair. "Good night, Hermione. Good night, Draco." He went. She stood in the doorway and listened to his footsteps down the 3 flights, and the small click of the street door at the bottom, and the sound of the rain swelling for a moment as the door opened and falling again as it closed, and then only the rain. She closed her own door. She set the latch. She walked back into the kitchen, and she sat down at the table, and she picked up the small leather book, and she opened it, this time, to the 2nd page. She read, in the dim, warm light, what he had written about her 4 years ago, on an ordinary April afternoon, in a drawing room she had once thought she would live in for the rest of her life. And she read it slowly, all the way to the end of the entry, and her hand on the page was steady, and the lamp above the table held its soft amber for her, patient. And outside the rain went on falling on Bloomsbury and on the whole long sleeping city of London beyond. The 3rd debate was held in the atrium itself. The Wizengamot had decided, after the 2nd, that the country was watching too closely to be confined to a chamber on level 5. They had cleared the great central hall of the Ministry of its statuary, dimmed the gold chandeliers, raised a low circular dais between the silver fountains, and ringed it with seating for 2,000. Outside, in the rain, another 4,000 stood in Whitehall behind cordons, listening through amplified speakers that the Ministry Charms Department had set up on every lamppost from Trafalgar to the Embankment. The vote was in 3 days. Hermione arrived an hour early. She had not, in the 4 days since he had stood in her kitchen, seen him. They had each sent on the 2nd day a single owl. Hers had said only, "Friday. I will be on the stage." H. His had said only, "Friday. So will I." D. The exchange had been, in its own quiet way, the most reassuring correspondence she had received in 2 years. She walked through the atrium without her aide. She had asked that morning to be left alone for the final hour. Her press officer had protested. She had insisted. She walked the length of the hall in her dark navy robe, not the oxblood of the first debate, not the slate of any rehearsal, and she felt the cold of the marble through the thin soles of her shoes, and she thought, with a small, distant calm, that she had nothing prepared. She had her 3 pages of notes. She had not, that morning, been able to read them. She had folded them into her pocket out of habit, and she had not, on the cab ride over, taken them out again. The dais, when she reached it, was empty. She stood at the edge of it. She looked up. The enchanted ceiling, the one that ordinarily showed the weather of London above, had been altered for the evening to show, instead, a slow, pale wash of cloud, neutral and lit from within, the kind of sky one paints behind a portrait. She thought it was a kindness. She was not sure whose. Madame Granger. She turned. The moderator tonight was Madame Bones, the niece, not the aunt, who had taken over the Wizengamot's ceremonial functions in the spring. She was a tall witch with steady hands and a habit of speaking in even, unhurried sentences, as though sentences were a finite resource to be spent with care. Madame Bones. 5 minutes to the candidate's entry. Mr. Malfoy is in the East Hold. Did you wish to— No, Hermione said. Thank you. Madame Bones inclined her head. She did not, Hermione noticed, look surprised. She walked away across the marble with her hands folded behind her, the way she walked in the chamber, and Hermione stood alone on the edge of the dais for the 4 remaining minutes. And she did not, in the 4 minutes, think about what she was going to say. She thought, instead, about the lamp above the kitchen table, which had dimmed of its own accord at 11 o'clock on Monday night. She thought it had been, possibly, the kindest light she had ever sat under. The horn sounded. The candidates were called. She stepped up onto the dais from the west. He stepped up from the east. This time they did not cross 20 feet. The dais was circular and small. The lecterns had been placed not opposite one another, but at an angle, perhaps 12 feet apart, set so that each candidate faced half the audience and half the other candidate. She could see from her place the line of his jaw and the small, clean side of his hair, and the pale grey of his cuff against the dark of his lectern, and he could see, of her, the same. He looked at her. He inclined his head. She, this time, returned the inclination. A small thing. The press gallery behind the charmed screen at the rear registered it. She heard, even from where she stood, the tiny collective scratch of 200 quills writing down a half bow. Witches and wizards, said Madame Bones. The third and final debate. The subject for the evening. The office of the minister. 90 seconds per response. Direct address is permitted. A pause. Direct address is, in fact, the point. A small ripple in the hall. Not a laugh. Something gentler. She began. The first question, posed by the Wizengamot itself, to both candidates. What is the Minister for Magic for? Mr. Malfoy. 90 seconds. He did not consult his notes. He had not, she saw, brought any. The Minister for Magic, he said, is for the people who are not in this room. For the witch in a village in Cornwall who has not voted in 20 years because no candidate has ever spoken her name. For the squib child of a wizarding house who has been quietly written out of the family record. For the goblin clerk who is paid in coin, he is not, by treaty, permitted to hold in his own vault. For the house elf who has not been asked in 400 years what he would like. The minister is for them. The minister is not for the people in this room. The people in this room, and I include myself in this, are the minister's employers in a sense, but they are not the minister's purpose. I have, in the past, confused these two categories. I do not propose to confuse them again. He stepped back. The hall was very still. Madame Granger, 90 seconds. She had her notes in her pocket. She did not reach for them. Mr. Malfoy, she said, has answered the question better than I had planned to. I will, with the moderator's permission, answer a slightly different question. I will answer the question, what is the minister not for? The minister is not for the preservation of the minister's dignity. The minister is not for the maintenance of the minister's silences. The minister is not, above all, for the convenience of the minister's own life. I have been, in my own life, a person who confused those categories also. I have learned, recently, painfully in public, that the dignity of a public office is not improved by the silence of the person who holds it. It is, in fact, the opposite. The minister is for the speaking of difficult sentences in rooms where they have not yet been spoken. I am, I find, only now beginning to learn how to be such a person. I would, if elected, continue to learn. I would, if not elected, continue to learn anyway. She stepped back. Madame Bones did not speak for a moment. Then she said, "The second question." They moved through 6 questions. They answered them well. They answered them, in fact, with a strange, easy clarity that neither of them had brought to the previous debates. Neither performed, neither defensive, neither sharp. The audience, in the second hour, had begun to lean very slightly forward, the way an audience does when it has stopped trying to assess a contest and has started, instead, listening to a conversation. The 7th question came from Madame Bones herself. "Candidates," she said, "it has been suggested by both your parties that the country requires, at the close of this debate, a clear statement of difference between you. The vote is in 3 days. The country must choose. I will, accordingly, give each of you 3 minutes without interruption to state the difference between your candidacies. Mr. Malfoy, you may begin." He looked at his hands on the lectern. He looked, then, across at her. "Madame Bones," he said, "I will not, with respect, use my 3 minutes for that purpose. I will use them, instead, to do the thing I came here to do." A pause. The hall did not move. "I am, with this statement, withdrawing my candidacy for the office of Minister for Magic." She heard, very clearly, the sharp intake of breath of the press officer of the Heritage Alliance, somewhere in the 3rd row. She did not turn. She did not, in fact, look away from him. She watched his hands on the lectern. They had gone, again, white at the knuckle, but they did not move. "I am withdrawing," he said, "for 3 reasons. The first is that my opponent is the better candidate. I said so on this same stage 6 days ago, and I have not since found any reason to revise the judgment. The country, on the 21st, would be choosing well by choosing her. I would prefer, on balance, that the country choose her without the inconvenience of having me to vote against. The second reason is that I have, in the course of this campaign, learned something about myself that I should have learned, privately, years ago. I have learned that I have spent the greater part of my adult life in the practice of not saying the thing I most needed to say. I have, in the past 4 weeks, said 3 such things in public. I do not, by saying them in public, claim any credit for having said them. I claim only the small dignity of admitting that I should have said them, first, in private. I am not, I find, a person who is yet ready to be trusted with an office whose chief instrument is speech. He paused. The lamp above his lectern had brightened of its own accord into a soft, warm wash. The ministry's old enchantments had a kind way with people, sometimes, when people were doing a hard thing. "The third reason," he said. He looked across at her. The third reason is that I would like, if she will permit it, to ask my former wife a question. I will not, by asking it, expect an answer. I will be content, in fact, with no answer. I will be content with the asking. I have, all of my life, found it easier to keep my silences than to ask my questions, and I would like, at the close of a campaign in which I have learned a great many other things, to learn this one also. Madam Bones did not move. The hall did not move. 2,000 witches and wizards in a great marble atrium, and 4,000 more in the rain on Whitehall, and a press gallery of 200 behind a charmed screen, and not one of them moved. "Hermione," he said. He used her name without ornament. He used it as one uses the name of a person to whom one has not, in all the years one has known them, finally given up the right to speak to. "I am not asking you," he said, "to take me back. I am not asking you to forgive me. Both of those things, if they come at all, will come on a slower time than the time of this debate. And they will come, if they come, in a kitchen and not in an atrium. I am asking you only this. When the vote is counted on the 21st, and you are, as I believe you will be, the Minister for Magic, will you let me, at some quiet hour you yourself will choose, in some quiet room you yourself will choose, come and sit at a table opposite you, and say, for the first time and not the last, the things I have, for 2 years, said only to a small leather book. That is the question. That is all of it. I will not, by asking, expect any answer tonight." He stopped. The hall was perfectly silent. She stood at her lectern with both her hands flat on the wood. She had not, in the long minutes of his speaking, looked away from him. She did not, now, look away. She felt in her chest a thing she had not felt in 2 years, and which she did not, even now, have an immediate name for, only that it was warm, and that it had moved, and that it had a shape she recognized the way one recognizes the shape of one's own handwriting after a long absence. Madam Bones drew a careful breath. "Madam Granger, you have 3 minutes. You are under no obligation to use them in any particular—" "Madam Bones," Hermione said. "Yes, I will use them. Thank you." She looked, not at the hall, not at the press gallery, not at the cameras hovering in their small enchanted arc above the dais. She looked at him. She looked at the line of his shoulders, and the pale grey of his cuff against the dark of the lectern, and the small unsteady place at the side of his jaw, where 6 days ago the razor had skipped. "Draco," she said. "Yes. I will answer your question now, not in 3 days. Now." A small movement in him, the slight straightening of his head, no more. "The answer," she said, "is yes." She paused. She held the answer in the air a moment longer, because she wanted the country to hear accurately what she was saying. "Yes," she said. "You may sit at a table opposite me. Yes. You may say the things you have for 2 years, said only to the book. You may say them in a kitchen. You may say them in whatever quiet hour we, between us, choose. I will, in that hour, listen. I will, in that hour, also speak. There are things I have said only to the dark of a cab and to the back of my own hand on a table at 1 in the morning. And I have learned this past week that I do not any longer wish to say them only to those places. I will say them to you. I am not, by saying yes, promising you anything beyond the sitting and the speaking. I am promising you the sitting and the speaking. I am promising you also that I will not again leave a doorway without looking up." She stopped. She had not, in the saying, lifted her hands from the lectern. She lifted one of them now. She lifted it across the small space between their two lecterns, palm half open, the same hand she had held in the air at the end of the second debate, and lowered again unanswered. This time he raised his. Their hands did not touch. They were 12 feet apart. The gesture was only that, a gesture, two open palms held across a small lit space in the great marble atrium of the Ministry of Magic. But it was, and the hall, and the press gallery, and the 4,000 in the rain on Whitehall knew it was. The first thing they had done in public in 7 years that had been done only for one another. Madam Bones, after a moment, cleared her throat very softly. "The debate," she said, "is concluded." She did not, for the first time in her career, add anything further. She inclined her head to the candidates, and she stepped down from the moderator's table, and she walked across the marble to the eastern doors, and behind her the press gallery's charmed glass began, very slowly, to ring with the dropped quills of 200 journalists who had not, in the event, written down the last 3 minutes of the debate at all. On the dais, neither Hermione nor Draco moved. They stood at their lecterns with their hands still half raised in the warm wash of the atrium light, and they looked at one another across the small lit space, and the country watched, and they did not, for the long-held moment before the applause began to rise, lower their hands. She was sworn in on a clear, cold Tuesday in late October. The ceremony was small. She had asked for it to be small. The Wizengamot, which had wanted a procession down Diagon Alley with banners and a goblin honour guard, had been talked by stages into a private oath-taking in the old council chamber with 70 witnesses, no banners, and the honour guard reduced to 2 polite young wizards holding ceremonial wands at the back of the room. She wore navy. She took the oath with her hand on a copy of the Statute of Secrecy that had been printed by the Ministry Press on the morning of her birth. Her mother wept in the second row. Her father did not weep, but he held her mother's hand the entire time, and Hermione, who saw it, did not weep either, but stored the image away in a small private place where she had been recently learning to keep such things. Draco was not at the ceremony. He had written the week before to ask whether she would prefer that he attend or not, and she had written back to say that she would prefer that he attend the small supper she was holding at the flat afterwards, instead, with Harry and Ginny and 3 other people, and that the ceremony, on balance, she would rather take on her own. He had written back, "Yes, the supper, thank you. D." She had read the 3 lines twice and put the letter in the drawer of the kitchen table with the first one and gone to bed earlier than she had managed in some weeks. The supper was at 7. He arrived at 10 to. He had not, she noticed when she opened the door, brought flowers. She had asked him in writing not to bring flowers. He had brought, instead, a single bottle of a wine she had loved in their 2nd year of marriage, and not, since the settlement, been able to find in any London merchants. She did not ask how he had got it. He handed it to her on the threshold with the small, precise gravity of a man returning a borrowed book. "Minister," he said, "don't. Once. Only once. Once, then." "Minister, he said again, and the corner of his mouth did the thing it had done on the first debate stage, and on the landing in the rain, and at her kitchen table at 1 in the morning. Only easier now, only with more practice behind it, only with less held back. She did not, in the event, allow herself to smile. She did, however, step aside, and he came in, and the supper went on for 4 hours, and she did not, for the 4 hours, sit near him at the table, and he did not, for the 4 hours, try to sit near her at the table, and twice, across the candlelight, she found him looking at her with the steady, attentive quietness with which he had looked at her in the archive, and twice she looked back, and neither of them, on either occasion, looked away. At 11, Harry and Ginny went home. The other 3 went shortly after. Draco rose with the last of them and put on his coat in the hall and turned at the door. "Saturday," he said, "if you are free." "For what?" "To sit at a table opposite me." "Where?" "Wherever you prefer." She thought about it. "Here," she said. "Saturday, 8. 8. Don't bring wine." "No." "Don't bring flowers." "No." "Bring," she said, "only yourself." He inclined his head. He went. She closed the door. She stood with her back against it for a moment, and the flat was quiet around her, and the lamp in the hall, the one that had taken over the past 3 months to dimming itself when she was tired and brightening when she was reading, held its soft amber steady, and she thought, with a clarity she did not just then examine, that it had been a very good day. Saturday came. He arrived at 3 minutes to 8. He had this time brought nothing, only himself, only the dark coat over the dark jumper, only the small clean shape of his hands at his sides. She let him in. She did not this time lead him to the kitchen at once. She led him instead into the small sitting room she had 2 weeks ago finally let herself buy a second armchair for. She had not, in any conversation with anyone, named the reason for the second chair. She had bought it on a Tuesday afternoon in Camden, paid for it in cash, and asked the shop to deliver it the next morning. It was a small green chair, slightly worn at the arms, the kind of chair one read in. He looked at it. He did not, characteristically, say anything about it. He sat down in it. She took the other chair. They sat across the small, low table from one another. There was a teapot on the table. She had made the tea before he arrived. She poured. He took the cup. He did not, for a long moment, drink. "I have been thinking," he said, "about how to begin." "Begin," she said, "however you like." He set down the cup. "I do not any longer work at Gringotts." "I know. The papers." "I have taken a position at the Wizarding Institute for Magical Law Reform, as a researcher, not a barrister. I will, in 3 years, be permitted to apply for readmission to the bar if I wish. I do not, at present, know whether I wish." "That is a junior position." "It is." "At a salary, presumably, of a great deal less." "Yes." "Why?" He looked at the teapot. "Because I had been," he said, "very tired. Because I had been, for some years, doing work I had chosen, because it was the work that was offered to me when I was 22 and frightened, and I have not, since, asked myself whether it remained the work I wished to do. I have asked myself this autumn. The answer was no. I have taken 3 months. I have arranged my affairs. I have moved into a smaller flat in Holborn. I am writing a paper at present on the 7th subsection of the Magical Property Reform Bill. I believe it may in time be of use to your office. My office did not commission it. No. Will you accept payment for it? No. She looked at him for a long moment. She did not, this time, ask the next question. Why not? Because she understood, with the small, clear certainty she had been learning to trust, what the answer would be, and that asking would be a way of making him say a thing he had already, by his actions, said. Draco. Yes. I want to ask you something. Yes. Will you, in time, want children again? He did not look away. I do not know, he said. I have thought about it. I have not been able yet to think about it without thinking also about Lyra. I do not know whether the not being able is something that will pass. I suspect that it is. I am not in a hurry to find out. I would like, if you will let me, to find out slowly and without committing either of us to any particular answer. That is, in fact, what I had hoped you would say. And you, the same. I have thought about it. I have not yet been able to think about it without thinking also of her. I do not know either. He nodded. The lamp on the small table dimmed a degree, considerate. Hermione. Yes. There is one more thing. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat, which he had not, in the warmth of the flat, taken off. He drew out a small velvet pouch. He set it on the table between them. He did not, in setting it down, push it across. She knew what it was before he spoke. This is yours, he said. I have kept it. I have not, in 2 years, known what to do with it. I will not, by giving it back, suggest anything by the giving. I am giving it back because it is yours, and because I have only recently come to understand that the thing one does with a thing that belongs to another person is to return it, even if one does not, at the time of returning, know what the returning means. You may put it in a drawer. You may sell it. You may, if you wish, throw it into the Thames from Westminster Bridge. I will not ask, and I will not, on any occasion in the future, ask. I am only returning it. She drew the pouch towards her. She loosened the cord. She tipped the contents into her palm. It was the ring. It was the small, old, Granger-side ring her grandmother had left her, the one she had asked the jeweller to set into her wedding band when she had married him, because she had wanted, in the band, something that was hers before he had been. After the settlement, she had told her solicitor in a moment she had since regretted that he could keep it. She had said it because she had wanted to be the kind of person who did not, in a divorce, fight for objects. She had been, for 2 years, quietly sorry. She closed her hand around it. Thank you, she said. Yes, I am putting it on. You needn't, just because I am not putting it on for you. I am putting it on because it was my grandmother's, and I have for 2 years missed it on my hand. Yes, he said. I know. I had hoped you would say that. She slid it onto the small finger of her right hand. It fitted, the way it had always fitted, neither tight nor loose, the way an object that has belonged to one's family for 4 generations fits the hand of the person it has come to. She held the hand up to the lamp for a moment, considering it. He watched her hand. He did not, this time, look at her face. He looked at the small dark stone in the small old gold, and the corner of his mouth did the thing, and his hand on the arm of the green chair, which had been very still, relaxed at last. She set her hand down on the small table. After a moment, with no announcement and no haste, She turned the hand over, palm up. He looked at it. He looked at her. She did not speak. She had said this time all she had decided to say. The rest was for him. He reached across the small, low table. He laid his hand, palm down, into hers. He did not close his fingers. She did not close hers. They sat for a moment with their two hands open against one another across the table, the way they had sat in her kitchen on the night of the rain. Only this time he had come to her with nothing in his arms, and she had asked him for nothing but himself. And the ring was on her hand, and the green chair was under him, and the lamp on a table had brightened of its own accord a single warm degree. And then, very slowly, his fingers closed, and then, very slowly, hers did. They sat that way for a long time. They did not, for the long time, speak. The lamp held its amber. Somewhere on the floor below, a clock struck the half-hour, a single soft note, and was answered dimly by another, deeper in the building. The flat was quiet around them, the considerate, attentive quiet of a place that had, for 2 years, been kept by one person and was now, for the first time, being kept by 2. And Hermione Granger sat across a small, low table from Draco Malfoy, with her hand closed around his, and his closed around hers. And she thought, with the clarity she had been learning to trust, that this was not the end of anything. It was, she thought, the beginning of an ordinary life. It would have ordinary mornings. It would have ordinary kettles and ordinary tea and ordinary disagreements over the 7th subsection of the Magical Property Reform Bill. It would have, in time and on a slower clock than the clock of any debate, the speaking aloud of all the words that had once been kept in a small leather book. And it would have, in time, the speaking aloud also of all the words she had kept in the dark of cabs and at the backs of her own hands on tables at 1 in the morning. There would be a kitchen, and the kitchen would have a name spoken in it. There would, in some quiet hour neither of them had yet chosen, be a conversation about a small green nursery that had never, in the event, been used. There would be, perhaps, a second nursery in a different house, on a slower clock. There would be, perhaps, no nursery at all. There would be, either way, the 2 of them at the table, and the speaking, and the listening, and the small ordinary courage of finishing the sentences that had once been left hanging. She did not, after a long time, withdraw her hand. He did not, after a long time, withdraw his. The country, that day, was governed by a minister who had been, at noon, in a meeting about the Goblin Treaties, and who was, at 9:30 in the evening, on an ordinary Saturday in late October, sitting in a small green armchair in a flat in Bloomsbury, with her hand closed around the hand of a man she had once been married to, and had, against every prediction of every newspaper in Britain, decided to begin to know again. Outside, the night over London was clear, and the lamp on the small low table held its amber, and somewhere in the dark, on a high shelf in an unlit kitchen, a small leather book lay closed on its spine, with all its pages folded down, waiting, patient as it had always been patient, for the slow, long reading that was, at last, finally beginning. The cottage stood on the lip of a slow green valley, 3 miles from the village of Castle Combe. They had bought it in the 2nd spring, not the spring after the debate, Not the spring after they had begun to sit at the small low table on Saturdays, but the spring after that one, when the sitting had become a staying, and the staying had become a question neither of them had been in any hurry to answer aloud, and the question had answered itself one wet March morning over toast and the prophet. He had said, looking up from the paper, "There is a house in Wiltshire I should like to show you." She had said, "Not Malfoy land." He had said, "No, not Malfoy land. A cottage, a small one, with a kitchen I have not ever made tea in." She had set down her cup. She had said, "Show me." They had moved in the August. He had carried, himself, the small leather books up the narrow stair to the room at the back of the house, where she kept her own writing things. He had set them on the shelf above her desk without ceremony, and she had not, that day or any day since, asked him whether he wished them shelved elsewhere. They had stayed on the shelf. She had read, over the years, perhaps half of them. She had read them slowly. She had read them often, with him sitting in the green chair on the other side of the small low table they had brought with them from Bloomsbury, reading his own book, looking up occasionally when she made a small sound she did not know she had made. Lyra's name was spoken in the cottage on the first night they slept in it. They had not, in advance, agreed to speak it. They had been sitting on the floor of the kitchen with a half-unpacked crate between them and a bottle of the wine he had once produced on the night of the swearing-in. And she had said, into the soft, lamp-lit quiet, she would have been 7 now. He had said, yes, in June. He had said, "I am glad we are here when we say so." She had said, "Yes, I am glad too." They said her name after that when they wished to. Some weeks they did not wish to. Some weeks they wished to often. The cottage, which was a forgiving cottage, made room for both kinds of weeks. Rose was born in the 4th spring. She arrived 3 days after the equinox in the small lying-in room at St. Mungo's that the healers had, with great delicacy, set aside for them. Hermione had wept this time when the healer had said she is here. She had wept without trying to hide it, with her face turned into Draco's shoulder, and Draco had not, characteristically, wept. But he had not let go of her hand for 40 minutes after the healer had withdrawn, and when he had finally, very carefully, taken the small wrapped weight of his daughter into his own arms, he had said, aloud, in a voice that did not shake, but did not, also, pretend, "Hello, we have been waiting for you. We were not in any hurry to rush you. Thank you for coming." Rose was, at 18 months, a serious child with her mother's hair and her father's grey eyes, and a strong opinion about the proper arrangement of wooden blocks. She did not, yet, speak in sentences. She spoke in nouns, cup, owl, da, mum, Lyra, because they had told her, on the small low bench in the garden one afternoon, when she had asked who the photograph on the mantel was, and she had absorbed the name the way she absorbed all names without difficulty as a fact of the household. The household was a fact she was comfortable with. The ministry, in the meantime, had survived 2 further elections under Hermione's tenure, and had, in the 3rd year, passed the full magical property reform bill, in a form not perfectly resembling either party's original manifesto, but acceptable, in the event, to most of the Wizarding Nation and to Draco's quietly written research papers, 3 of which had been cited in the final drafting. He had not, in the end, returned to the bar. He had stayed at the Institute. He had been promoted twice against his own polite objections. He came home most evenings at 6, walked the long way up the lane from the apparition point, and was, by 10 past, in the kitchen with his sleeves rolled to the elbow and Rose on his hip, asking Hermione about her day. Hermione, in the meantime, had decided in the previous autumn not to stand for a 3rd term. She had announced it quietly in an interview with Pansy Parkinson, who had, over the years, become something Hermione would not aloud call a friend, but would not also deny was approximately one. And the country had taken the announcement with the same surprised, accepting hush with which it had taken 5 years before his withdrawal at the 3rd debate. She would serve out the year. She would, in the spring, hand the office to whichever candidate the country chose. She had plans. She had drafted in the small writing room at the back of the house the outline of a book about magical legal reform that she had been wanting for 9 years to write. She had, also, taken to walking with Rose along the bridle path through the wood at the end of the garden in the mornings, slowly, because Rose walked slowly, and noticing things she had not, in 15 years of public life, had time to notice. The way frost set on a particular kind of leaf, the small, precise call of the wren in the hawthorn, the way her own breath went in cold air. She had told her mother on the telephone one evening, happier than she had been in any year of her life that she could clearly recall. Her mother had said, gently, "I am glad, my love." Her mother had not added, "I had been worried about you," because her mother had learned over the long years of her daughter's public life not to say such things aloud where they would do no good. But Hermione had heard the not saying. She had said, "Thank you, Mum." She had hung up the telephone. She had stood for a moment in the hall with her hand on the receiver, and she had felt the small, clear warmth of the lamp above the door, and she had gone back into the sitting room where Draco was reading on the floor, with Rose climbing very deliberately up the slope of his bent knee. "Hello," he had said, looking up. "Hello," she had said. "All well, all well." She had sat down on the rug beside them. Rose had transferred herself without ceremony into Hermione's lap and had pressed a small wooden block against Hermione's cheek with the firmness of a witch performing a procedure. And Draco had watched them both with the steady, attentive quietness he had brought now to 9 years of watching her, and the lamp in the corner had brightened by a single warm degree. On the evening of the 5th anniversary of the 3rd debate, they sat at the small low table from Bloomsbury, which had come with them to the cottage, and which lived now by the window in the sitting room. Rose was asleep upstairs. The wireless was on, low, in the kitchen, playing the kind of soft string music Draco preferred, and Hermione had, over the years, come to prefer also. The rain, there was rain that night, a long, even autumn rain on the slate of the roof, came down without urgency, the way rain comes down over a house that has stood in some form for 400 years and is in no hurry about anything. She poured the tea. He took the cup. They did not, for a long moment, speak. They sat across the small table the way they had sat across it in the flat in Bloomsbury on the night he had brought her the first book, only easier now, only with the long, patient weight of 5 years' practice in the silence. "Hermione," he said, Yes. Thank you. For what? For the door, for the kitchen, for the doorway you did not, in the end, leave without looking up. She set down her cup. She reached across the small low table. She laid her hand, palm up, on the wood. He set his hand into hers without hesitation. Their fingers closed. The ring on her right hand, her grandmother's small old ring, which she had worn now for 5 years without removing, caught the lamplight and gave it back, soft, gold, contented. Thank you, she said, for knocking. I had to knock 3 doors. I know. The second was a man who recognized me from the paper. I know. You have told me 4 times. I shall tell you, in time, a 5th. I shall, in time, listen. He raised her hand. He did not, even now, do it grandly. He raised it only as far as his own mouth, and he pressed his lips very lightly to the small fold of skin between her thumb and the ring on her finger, and he did not, in pressing, say anything further. He did not need to. The cottage, the lamp, the rain on the slate, the small sleeping weight of Rose 2 floors above them, the row of leather books on the shelf above the desk, all of it, the whole quiet, long-built fact of their life, said it for him. She let her hand rest after he had lowered it on the back of his where it had come to settle on the small table. She closed her eyes for a moment. She opened them. She said, "It is late." He said, "It is." She said, "Come to bed." He said, "Yes." He rose. She rose. He put out the lamp on the small low table. The lamp dimmed obligingly under his hand, as it had been dimming obligingly under her hand for 5 years. And they went together up the narrow stair of the cottage in Wiltshire. And the rain went on, even and unhurried, on the slate of the roof. And the small leather books on the shelf above the desk in the writing room slept their long, contented sleep. And on the mantel in the sitting room, the photograph of a child who had never, in the event, been held, looked steadily out into the warm, dim quiet of the room, and was, in the household that held her name, remembered and loved, and not any longer unspoken.